And
all right, well, we are at the top of the hour, so perhaps we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Making the Connection, Driving Change, Education for Community Resilience. My name is Julie Bastine with Dickinson College's Alliance for Aquatic Resource Monitoring, and I am fortunate enough to be a part of the planning team for the Chesapeake Watershed Forum. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The session is being recorded, and we're currently recording right now. And recordings will be made available at a later date to be determined. All attendees will be muted unless you are speaking. Please use the chat box feature if you have any questions throughout this session. If you have any technical difficulties, send a message in the chat box to me or Meredith Dash, who's helping to run our technical show here. And we encourage everyone to rename yourself with your preferred name, pronouns, and organizations if you wish. Lastly, the rest of the forum schedule can be found on sketch.com. And this is the last session of the day, so be sure to check out offerings for tomorrow. I'm really excited for this incredible team of presenters that's going to be engaging this topic today. We have Bart Merrick, Krista Hogan, Jeremy Hoffman, Frank Niepold, and Jen Kretzer. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bart.
awesome. Thank you very much, Julie. And thank you all for joining us. We're really grateful that you could be here and kind of engage in this conversation a little bit about resilience, education, and opportunities to kind of connect with the community around us. We can go to the next slide. Oops. Yeah, cool. And maybe the next one. And the next one. Yeah, so we can pause on just quickly, we'll take a quick second to turn cameras on, but we can go around the horn in terms of the folks that are helping to support this session, like our panel, if you will. And maybe if we just kind of start with Jeremy, if you can just say hello and where you're from kind of thing.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jeremy Hoffman. I'm the Chief Scientist at the Science Museum of Virginia in Richmond, Virginia, reporting live where we have the remnants of Hurricane Zeta coming through. So we're experiencing extreme weather, all too familiar with us right now. So I saw a few people on the Padlet saying that they work on stormwater mitigation, and hopefully it's going to be doing its fair share of work this afternoon. So hello, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeremy. Chris, do you mind going next?
Hi, everyone. I'm Krista Hogan, and I work at the NOAA Environmental Science Training Center, and I'm out of Easton, Maryland.
Thank you. Jen, how about yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name's Jen Kretzer. I'm the Director of Climate Initiatives at the Wild Center in Northern New York State. So I'm coming to you from the snowy Adirondack Park today.
Snowy, wow.
Yep, snowy, but that's normal. It's normal.
And Frank, you mind going next?
Sure, happy to be here. Can you hear me? I didn't.
Yep.
All right, cool. It didn't drop over. I guess I still see you, Bart. Hey, very happy to be here. I'm Frank Niepold. I'm the Climate Education Coordinator and Program Manager for NOAA's Climate Program Office in Silver Spring, but I'm not actually in Silver Spring because no one's in Silver Spring at NOAA. So, but really happy to be with you all today.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm Bart Merrick, and I also work with the NOAA Chesapeake Bay office with Krista and a program called the Environmental Science Training Center. So you can go ahead and click. Thanks, Meredith. So within this session, there's a lot that we're going to try and kind of introduce and have conversations about. But the big point is that throughout the session, we're making the case or continuing to make the case, as I've heard in other sessions, of engaging the community around resilience topic and how essential that is. So right from the plenary this morning to at least the two sessions that I dropped in on, that was a core theme, and I love to see that. And then the second thing is, thinking about our cultural institutions, so our science museums, our art museums, our nature centers, our educational institutions, as key partners in connecting to communities and supporting resilience overall. There's another of other things, like when we're definitely raise some awareness about the programs that are out there, and Jen and Jeremy are going to highlight some models that are have done some really cool work in terms of engaging communities around the topic of resilience and using education as a component of that. And then also do some more thinking just about that kind of trusted anchor in communities of cultural institutions and why and how to kind of connect to them. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we're going to try and dig into here today. But we can go to that next slide, Meredith, please. Thank you. And our agenda looks like this, right? So we're going to be moving through things pretty quickly. We strongly encourage an active dialogue within the chat and love and welcome that. And we'll be maintaining it, kind of and monitoring it throughout the whole thing. So we'll be able to kind of address questions on the fly, and at times we'll open up and verbalize those as well. But yeah, so we're gonna kind of kick it off with a quick breakout and conversation about the topic of resilience based on the feedback you've already provided in the Padlet maps. And then we're gonna turn it over to Frank for a big landscape picture about climate, education, resilience out there. And then look at a couple models of how this is being done. One with Jen up in New York and beyond, and one with Jeremy based out of Richmond, but again, beyond. And then bring it all back to a conversation about meaningful watershed education experiences and the connections with resilience. So we can go ahead to the next one, please. So just really quickly, what is resilience? Take just 10 seconds, write up a quick thing in the chat, and then go ahead and drop it in. Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Bouncing back. Yeah, adaptable, future thinking. I love that. Not just looking about getting back to where we were, but let's look towards what's coming next. And that ability to overcome challenges. Yeah, anticipate changing situations, and the ability to thrive despite these changes that might be coming. And I know that's one of the anchor points I think that's really important. And seeing this bouncing forward better and all that sort of things that people are putting in, I think to me that implies that we're not just talking about, everybody getting back to the status quo, but when we bounce forward, we make the world a better place, which includes things like how do we reach out to more communities to engage them in resilience and help them be resilient, and not just help them be resilient, but find resilience within their own community, which I think is more what we're up to. So we can go to the next slide. Thank you very much. So for the part of the background in this conversation, this is what I've been using to describe resilience and what it means. So I'll pause here for a second and let people just digest that. But essentially, what that means to me is like taking these challenges that we're faced with and bouncing forward and kind of creating new systems, modifying systems so that we can do things better, ultimately. So we can go ahead and click next. Thank you, Frank, for dropping that in there. One of the things, I sent an email out to everybody that kind of registered to participate, and we kind of put it into the chat a whole bunch of times, but we asked folks to go to Padlet, and Padlet is this kind of cool, interactive, educational resource where you can add content. But what I'm gonna ask folks to do, if you haven't already, is go to Padlet and just kind of click on your location or find your location and add that to the map, and then just put in a sentence about your resilience issue that exists within that community. And what we're going to do then is right now, in a couple minutes, we're going to break out into some groups for about 8 minutes and have a quick conversation, really small groups of 3 people or 4 people. And within those groups, and we can click to the next slide. The ask is that you take a minute and you just introduce yourself quickly, because ideally it'll be some new people that you might not have met. A little bit about where you work and live, but then what is your resilience issue, and how are you, or how could you, or how are you planning to engage the community that you're planning on working with around that topic. And the sky's the limit here. So enjoy the conversation. And like I said, we're going to come back in about 8 minutes to wrap that conversation up. So with that, the ask is go to Padlet, put stuff in, respond to these questions. We'll put them into the chat as well. so that you have them, and then we'll be back here in 8 minutes. So Meredith, do you mind putting people in some rooms? Well, I think we're okay. I mean, I think it would just take up a bunch of time if we went back. So I think it's okay to kind of move forward. But I did want to, I had a nice conversation with Holly, and if anybody wanted to highlight or uplift anything that they heard in those quick conversations about how people are, what people's resilience issues are, and how they're engaging the community, I would love to have a volunteer either put it in the chat, or if you wanted to, unmute yourself and offer that up, that'd be great.
I could talk about our group.
Awesome, thanks, Rob.
We work on primarily stormwater, urban stormwater, and trees in my group. And we were talking about really getting the community engaged in it and getting them to understand the importance of resilience with those topics, with trees and stormwater.
Cool. Thank you, Robin. I think we might have a minute for one more if anybody wanted to offer some other ideas.
This is Don Callahan. I live in Baltimore County for Gunpowder Valley Conservancy, and we're starting to see conflicts in our more rural areas and in areas along state parks and county parks that have trails, with a lot of people trying to get into nature after being sequestered from COVID, and a lot of then impacts, parking, litter, just too many people infringing on private property, et cetera. And I think we need to start looking at how we create more of an outdoor ethic to help everyone understand how they should be behaving in the outdoors.
Yeah, I've heard that a couple times. And did anybody have any ideas of maybe ways to engage the community, like specifically around some of those ethic issues? It's a tough one because people, like, there's this transient in a lot of those spots, right? And so it comes to that's one of those long-term campaigns, right, of trying to encourage and still, like, over really long periods of time. And I think we heard about this in the session on engaging the Latino population. They're saying, why is there trash here? And they're kind of attributing it maybe to Latinos that were in that area. And the response was something along the lines of like, hey, leave no trace has been something that has been kind of communicated in certain circles for a long time, but not in other circles. And we need to broaden the work that we're doing to kind of communicate about that type of thing to bigger audiences, was one specific suggestion.
Some of the issues are the not in my backyard syndrome, that, this trail that goes by my house, that, I don't want those people up here.
Yeah, that's one of the other challenges here. And one of the cool things I think about the topic of resilience and the notion of bouncing forward into maybe a better perspective on some of these things is how do we recognize our perspectives and where we're coming from and what an ideal situation might be down the road, and really work through some of those harder conversations for some people to get there. And resilience, I think, is one of those framings that lets us get there. And can help us get there. So thank you very much, Don. And there's some other cool stuff, I think, in this chat here that is good to look at and reflect on, and we'll be checking that stuff as we move through. But I just want to say this Padlet link, this is open, it's there. It's definitely some cool stuff that people have put in there. So feel free to poke around as we continue. And with that, I think we can go to the next slide, and I wanted to turn it over to Frank to kind of present that landscape piece on the connections between environmental literacy and education work and resilience.
Absolutely. So I'm super happy to be with you guys. And I just want to frame this in a reality, because, I work at NOAA's Climate Program Office. I've worked on the National Climate Assessment for NOAA. I've been here for 15 years. And, the reality that, many years ago, we used to think climate change is coming. Well, now climate change is fully here and getting stronger. And there are events that are impacting communities. This is from Superstorm Sandy impacting a part of New York City. And you have these increasing impacts on all range of them. And you see this in California right now. You see it in Colorado right now. You see it in Louisiana right now, and it keeps on going. And so, but the reality is that the impacts are coming, or they're going to be coming to a community somewhere, in this case, the Chesapeake Bay region. But trying to make those connections between schools and school systems and education systems to face and address and get ahead of and be proactive is really one of the things that we've been focusing on for quite a few years, and we've made some real progress. So I think one of the things you may not be aware of at NOAA, and out of our Office of Education, we've been making some very important investments across the country. Now, not all of these are going to relate to something that you care about and you are interested in, but there's a variety in each of these projects. And one of the things that is important to NOAA is that while the innovation may have come from Washington State or New York State or Michigan, its transferability and its replicability in order to help inform practices on issues, because we don't have the money to fund everything everywhere. But the models that are starting to show up are really important. So we have today 2 grantees that have been funded by this work. So you're going to get a sense of it, but there's a wider body of work that we can't get into today. So I just want to make sure that we're there. And one of the things, and you might be seeing this hand signal, that's just how we're communicating. Just one that might be important just to consider as an example is a model that's coming out of New York City, which is a project called RISC, the Resilient Schools Consortium. It's a really interesting model. It's really looking at schools in partnership with people who are leading climate actions or resilience work in those communities. And that partnership is showing up to be a really important part. It's a new way of thinking about this. We don't always think about people who are leading climate actions or resilience actions as needing deep engagement with their communities, and schools being part of that. But that's emerging in these grants and these innovations. So it's a really important one to think about. So when you think about that, right now, we don't have any of these investments in the say, for example, the small islands off of in the Chesapeake Bay itself, or in Baltimore, for example. So, but those challenges, whether what's going on in Brooklyn is very similar to what's going to be facing and is already facing Baltimore or Annapolis or more metropolitan areas, but then also the small communities, some of those challenges. So we're trying to figure out how to bridge our innovations, what we're learning, and these new models into these communities where we didn't have direct investments. And I think that's so really this point of this conversation today is just to highlight some of this work, put it in a context, and really start thinking about education systems, not just schools, but all systems, whether they're informal, formal, higher education, community colleges, as part of how you go about building resilience to whatever challenges those communities are facing. So, one thing that might be helpful just to socialize and get in here is this theory of change that's just been developed. The links, Bart, you want to pop that link into the theory of change? Perfect, love it, love teamwork. But in there, you're starting to look at how we actually build community resilience. What we're finding is education of all forms play a critical role. They play a critical role. They're already part of the infrastructure of community, but bringing them into the process in order to get the long-term social outcomes we're finding is a critical piece. So if you're talking about stewardship of healthy ecosystems, transition to a low carbon economy, a climate smart, requires inclusive decision-making, because the risks are increasing. And the current and future environmental housing is going up. So, but I just want to make sure that as we all are practitioners in this space, we begin thinking about the powerful contributions that education brings to this and these pathways. So if you can go to the next one. Really, this is just my as I've been, in this journey, this may not work for everybody. I'm still working on this diagram, but what we're finding is if community resilience is what you're trying to, in whatever topic you're looking at, the idea of youth and community members playing a critical role in what this community leaders are doing, they play a powerful contribution to the building of community resilience. That's really what this is trying to show. But specifically youth, and I'm gonna have Jen Kretzer here, who's gonna be talking about this, plays a critical role in what we're doing and in surprising ways. So, Jen is going to get into that, but that we're finding is that this is actually an incredibly important dimension that is emerging in our work, and it might be important to your work. So, so we can get to the next one. And so I'm just socializing that there are these causal pathways in the theory of change. And it shows you how you go from short-term outcomes all the way down. If you can click the next one, it'll zoom in on this. But the ultimate outcome we're looking for is resilience, policy, decision-making, implement preparedness, adaptation, mitigation strategy, incorporate the values of society to improve community health and bolster socioeconomic equity in this case. Really important dimensions. So this is new thinking. I just want to socialize with you guys. NOAA's learning, as all of the people we're working with are learning, and some of the things we're learning are incredibly important to building the social and physical and natural resilience. They have to come together. And what we're seeing is that you're getting an example of that here. So let's go to the next one. And now that's where we're going to get to Jeremy as one example. And I think that I hope you get a sense of this. I'll be over here in the chat from here to forward, but I just want to say that what we are learning is really fresh, new, exciting, important. And those enterprises that are in your communities, they're your ally. Work with them, partner with them, bring them into the work, because the other thing is students and youth need to see the work because they need to see progress, because it's on these issues, they really need to, they're ready to roll up their sleeves and get into it and work in this area. And there's a lot of work to be done. So bring them in, and it also helps them feel like we're making progress on some really, really important issues. So hopefully that's good.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Frank. And
Sure.
I think with that, we'll pass the baton over to Jeremy to tell us a little bit about what he's up to.
Okay, yes, thank you so much. I had to switch over to a different set of headphones out of nowhere, so I'm glad I did that just at the right time. So I need you all to access this, the Mentimeter information that's coming into the chat right now, if you would, or through the link that'll be posted into the chat coming through. It's an online polling software, and I actually want to start my presentation by finding out a little bit about what you think in the yes, this menti.com link. Please go to that. You can either use your smartphone and go to menti.com and type in the number that appears at the top of the screen here, or follow the link and actually just put in your ideas through your browser. This will allow us to just kind of get an idea of what does community or citizen science mean to you, as an introduction a little bit into what I'll be talking about today. All right, we see layperson, teamwork, action for your environment, empowering residents to build data sets. Everyone's data is counted, getting more community buy-in on projects, action for your environment. Hopefully you're seeing all of your results spread up on screen like this. Wonderful. We've got about 30 people who have put in their ideas here. General public engagement, bridging the gap between average people and environmental issues they might not be aware of. That's an interesting take on it. opportunity to engage with communities. So in the interest of sticking to time, I'm going to move in. You can see a lot about just kind of like community ideas, people that might not regularly be involved with science. Those are some of the ideas that are kind of coming to the top here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to invite you to also answer this question. Have you used community or citizen science in your work? How many people have done this as a strategy to include individuals or community members in their work? Well, it looks like actually quite a few people have done this, and that's good to see. A majority of folks coming in as a resounding yes. That's good. So I don't have to explain very much, particularly about community science. There are different definitions and things of that nature, depending on who you ask. But I'm going to share a little bit about how we have used community science at the Science Museum of Virginia very quickly. Won't be able to go into too much detail here, but how our work has evolved over time to include more and more about community science, and how that has informed our newest grant awarded to us by NOAA. I get a lot of help from a lot of amazing people in doing a lot of things. The Science Museum of Virginia started doing, in earnest, climate communication back in 2015 and 2016. We focused a lot on audio-visual programming and in-person skits and kind of demonstrations within the museum's walls. But what we quickly learned was that it was actually the inviting people from outside of our walls and connecting our visitors to emergency management, meteorologists, first responders. Those were the sorts of kinds of interactions that were actually developing a sharing pathway between the knowledge that the community had and the knowledge that the experts had. So that really started to come to a head in many ways when we decided to start localizing more of the impacts of climate change in our area. And so hyper-localization is the word that I'll be using for taking data and putting it down on like a block by block basis. And in the Chesapeake Bay area, the mid-Atlantic, we're expected to see anywhere between like 20 and 50 more days by the mid-century above 95 degrees, especially here in Richmond. That's a lot more days of feeling like you're walking around outside in someone else's mouth. If you breathe on your hand, that kind of hot, humid feeling is one of the ways to describe it. And of course, we care about heat because it's really the silent killer. It kills more people on average than any other weather-related stressor in the last 30 or 40 years. And we also know that climate or extreme heat doesn't express itself the same way everywhere. So if you're thinking to yourself, well, where in this picture might I go to find the hottest surface to the touch or the coolest surface to the touch? Your eyes might take you to the kind of common answers, like the asphalt being the warmest here in the brightest colors, and under the big tree being the coolest temperatures. And everything in between, from the different types of plants, like the native Virginia plants, tapping into lower parts of their longer root systems, allowing them to tap water and deeper than the non-native grasses here that we tend to put around our houses and schools. And then the different colors of the cars having something to do here as well. So all of those things from just this one picture, we can kind of grab at this scientific idea called the urban heat island effect. And we wanted to investigate this more deeply using a community science program in the city of Richmond. And thankfully, we had a really important first step that my colleague Vivek Chandas at Portland State University had already come up with a way to do this in a reproducible way and in a very low cost manner as well. And basically just hitching these little temperature sensors on the outside of a car. Kind of looks like a car flag for a sports team that you might be really enthusiastic about, but instead it's collecting temperature data as you move around a city. And with colleagues at the RVA Green 2050 plan, City of Richmond Sustainability Office, which you can learn more about here, as well as community organizations like Groundwork RVA, which has a mission to green Richmond and prepare youth for success in the workplace and education and realize racial equity. We had a really like a wide net or a wide umbrella tent to bring in a bunch of people that might have individualized knowledge of the environment around the city of Richmond. So we went out on 2017 on a really, really warm day. It was definitely the warmest day of the year. Well over 100 degrees for several hours. And we sent several teams around in different parts of the city. We actually made it a point to include different people from different organizations in the same cars. Now, you couldn't imagine doing that right now, of course, but back then it was a really unique opportunity for a teenager like Ijana here to spend some time with members of other organizations around the city. We found this 16-degree Fahrenheit difference between the coolest and warmest place. That's been kind of the same magnitude that we've also found in DC and Baltimore, where we've gone and done follow-ups. This correlates really closely, is a really strong predictor of where we find ambulance responses for heat-related illnesses. This is a really policy-relevant data set that was created from community-based involvement and planning. Follow-ups from this work have involved looking at the historical context, including looking at neighborhood redlining, or the practice of denying entire neighborhoods access to wealth back in the 1930s and 40s, mostly along racial lines. We see not only are those places hotter these days, but they have more paved surfaces, they have fewer trees, and of course, then that relates directly to their temperature. So this one community science program has now cascaded into community engagement from several organizations around the city of Richmond, coalescing around this idea of historical disenfranchisement and marginalization, including several grants awarded to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation from NIFWIF. We've been just awarded a new award from NOAA that I'll talk about right at the end. And the city of Richmond's mayor has announced 5 new green spaces in Richmond Southside, using the Heat Island data set as one of the ways that we can actually understand more about where to place those. And so what is the Science Museum Virginia doing? We're actually then taking a parking lot, tearing it up. The one that we saw in that picture before, we're actually turning it into a civic green space that'll provide shade for people on public transit in the city of Richmond. This community science data set has now gone on to influence several policy relevant things like Richmond 300, which is our comprehensive plan, the Richmond Land Bank's measure of community health, and the city of Richmond's now RVA Green 2050 plan, which is making its way through. And also, this is now used as an example of engagement in around heat islands in an equitable manner on the EPA's climate justice website. And so how has this actually then been used also in educational outcomes? Well, you can read about it in a paper that I published in the Journal of Museum Education. It's called Throwing Shade in RVA. We actually then use these little kind of like fake row homes that look familiar in architecture to a lot of cities in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, where we can explore both the drivers and solutions of extreme heat as well as extreme precipitation events. I know that was one of the things that a lot of people have been talking about. Simulations of these things and hands-on simulations and design challenges are one of the things that emerged as a really key role of encouraging students and people to have a deeper understanding of this stuff. Pre-post evaluation showed these are the kinds of words that the students were using before the Throwing Shade program, and afterwards they had a huge increase in their own personal vocabulary around these problems. We've now gone to several cities, dozens of cities now around the country, and this is a program that's put forth by the Kappa Strategies LLC and supported by the Climate Program Office at NOAA. So what now? I have about a couple minutes left. We'll try and get through the rest of these real fast. We're now doing community science around air quality measurements. We were funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services to do a new program called RV Air, where we're taking both stationary and mobile sensor measurements of particulate matter in the city of Richmond, which also correspond to historical patterns of land use. We have partners that have grown from the original community science program that we kind of continue to roll over into new projects. Devin Jefferson came back to the Science Museum of Virginia to be our community science catalyst. And here he is, even during a pandemic, socially distanced and with masks, still performing community science. You can still accomplish these goals and find meaningful information. Here, the gray box is along a busy intersection street in Richmond. The green box is in a more calm, limited traffic, more green neighborhood. And you can see how the difference in exposure along those two places. Now we can talk about, well, what do we do now with those data, which we'll be moving to in the near future in year 2 and year 3 of this grant. Finally, we just been awarded a new environmental literacy program grant to expand on our role as a science center in building community resilience to climate change through a really innovative collaboration with 4 local nonprofits, as well as the city. Groundwork RVA is a continuing partner, but Virginia Community Voice does this equitable community engagement program. Happily Natural Day has been working on urban agriculture programs, and Southside Relief has been focusing on increasing tree canopy in the south side of Richmond. And so it's kind of setting these community organizations up for like involvement in climate resilience building, to find like a shared dictionary, to understand where is the community coming from in understanding climate science. How can the Science Museum amplify the missions of these organizations as well as the city's desired outcomes? We kind of serve as this nexus point for understanding. And the ways that we're going to do that is through these deliberative forums. And there's a lot of examples to use, including the Museum of Science Boston's NOAA supported work on climate resilience platforms and deliberations. There's also the USDN's Game of Heat, Game of Extremes, and Game of Floods, kind of role playing and deciding where to put different interventions and where and why. And then finally, the Museum of Science or Life and Science have sustainable development goal
2 minutes, Jeremy.
Well. Thank you. I'm wrapping up just now. Thank you so much, Krista. That's perfect. Yes, so we have fortunately a lot of good work to borrow from, great ideas. It's all part of being a community of practice in this resilience education framework, and really this, the community science part and the deliberation, bringing communities together to make decisions is really where we want to go with this climate resilience work. And ultimately, we have the frameworks from the city's side, the RVA Green 2050 and Richmond 300, as well as the missions of these nonprofits, and the Science Museum trying to work to amplify all of it into climate resilience education outcomes. It's truly a pleasure to get to work on these things, and to have colleagues like Jen, who you're going to hear from next, who work as a sounding board and again, community of practice around these sorts of things. So with that, I'll yield the rest of my time, and we can move on to Jen's presentation. Thank you so much for that, for your attention.
Jeremy, thank you so much, man. So I think we have 1 minute maybe for a question. I just wanted to pose one that came from, because I'm always curious about this too. Like, are there recommended funding sources for community science projects out there that you would say are go-tos?
Right. So the Institute of Museum and Library Services is one that has this unique, specifically for science centers, is where we kind of came from it. We're not necessarily like a research center. So there might be ways to incorporate a citizen science or community science program within a larger research platform at a local university, which might be one of the ways to go about establishing one. But at the science center, a lot of the times it can be wrapped in with resilience education outcomes or anything like that at the same time. So they're probably like research level of funding through NSF and those sorts of things, and as well as the NOAA and any sort of museum and library service institution for that as well.
Yeah,
Hey, Bart, one quick point on that is there's a range of NOAA opportunities. So I would just keep your eye open on the Office of Education. We have just a huge diversity of support for citizen science or community science. So I would just track us as well. I know you mentioned it, but I would also track the Office of Education specifically.
And maybe we can drop some other stuff in the chat. And Jeremy and Paul, there were some good questions that came up in the chat too, that if you have a second to kind of poke your nose in there and respond to that, that'd be awesome. We can take that offline. But like what Jeremy was kind of just describing, right? This anchor community institution, the Science Museum of Virginia, based in Richmond, had at its core, climate education was part of what they did. And it, went from like videos to interactives to working with resilience entities in the community, like the firemen and stormwater folks, all the way through. Turn that one on. That's like I'm spinning it up, man. I'm spinning it up. Yeah. And all the way through, like engaging the community around a really important issue to Richmond, right? Urban heat. And all that happened around this institution in Virginia. And that anchor really has proved to be a huge asset to Virginia and way beyond with the work that Jeremy and your partners have all done. So we thank you for that. But similarly, cultural institutions up in New York have had some pay dirt in this space as well. And I was going to turn over to Jen to describe a little bit about what she's up to and how she's been working in this space.
Thanks so much, Bart. Hi, everybody. Again, I'm Jen Kretzer from the Wild Center. Next slide. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what resilience programming looks like in rural communities, particularly connecting schools, youth, communities with decision makers. So I know I think there was a question in the chat about that. I'll go ahead, next slide. So just a little bit more about where I am actually coming from. I think I mentioned earlier, I'm in a pretty snowy place in northern New York. I work for the Wild Center, which is a neuroscience museum, and we're kind of a mix or mashup between a science center, an aquarium, and nature center, located right in the central part of the Adirondack Park. Go ahead, next slide. And you're all welcome to come visit anytime. Just to give you some context, our community is the largest community in our 6 million acre park. Is about 5,000 people. That's Saranac Lake, where I am right now. Most of the communities, are somewhere between like 69 people and maybe like 2,000 or 3,000. So it's very rural. It's very red. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about sort of the politics of working on climate resilience in a rural space, because that's what our work is focused on. Next slide. And specifically, I'm going to talk about our youth climate program. So for the last 14 years, we have been working to bring young people together, high school students and college students specifically, to learn about climate science, impacts, and solutions. Next slide. We are really grounded in these values that you see in front of you. And that's been really foundational for our program, to ground ourselves in being solutions focused, action oriented, youth driven, to have equity at the center of the conversations and programming that we do, to be place based, and also to be work from a place of hope. So we come from a very optimistic space, in a place where we're working to empower, engage, and educate and work with young people. Next slide. So we do that primarily through youth climate summits, which are gatherings of anywhere from half a day to 3 days of young people interested in learning about climate change, the science, the local impacts, and working on solutions. Next slide. We focus on giving young people a grounding in the climate science, typically that they're generally not getting in schools, particularly that we're finding across rural regions of the state. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how that work is spilling out across the country and around the globe. Next slide. But our summits are really a mix of like workshops and plenary sessions, networking, really putting youth voice at the center of all of this. So for our summit at our museum, we typically see around 250 students from between 30 and 40 different high schools. And this is also all happening virtually. So yes, of course, these images are pre-pandemic, but these essentially are these big conference gatherings. So next slide. But what I believe sets us apart in this is this particular piece of it, this climate action plan. So as part of every single one of our summits, we have students work in teams together to create a student-driven action plan to bring back to their schools and communities. Those action plans can take all kinds of different forms. You know, they're high school kids. We've had carbon neutral proms, I remember was one idea, no mowing zones. Let's see what else, recycling, water bottle refilling stations. And then you start to see, as schools get more and students get more comfortable and they start to learn some of these leadership skills, that those start to spill out into the community in a much bigger way. So for example, large scale climate education events, working on solar power recharging stations, or getting electric car rechargers in these communities. So it really runs a huge continuum depending on where the schools are at and what they're ready to do in terms of change. Next slide. What's been exciting about this, and I think I mentioned we started back in 2009 and here we are in 2020, we've actually hosted over 80 summits or worked to inspire and encourage and mentor summits in 45 different communities around the world. So it's been exciting to see the iteration and sort of power of replication in this. So that's been really exciting, and we do have a lot of free materials, which I'll mention at the end, but of my presentation, but it's really been everywhere from like science centers to communities. There's actually one in Salisbury, Maryland, and over the last couple of years that BART has been engaged with. We've had them, there was a community resilience center in Sri Lanka, high schools, health centers, like all different kinds of places. So what we imagined originally was just going to be in a science museum, quickly took on its own, a life of its own, and now we have this huge network, which is really exciting. Next slide. So what I do want to focus with for the remainder of my time is actually how we're working with state and local government. Next slide. So one of the things that we've done, and this is through and with the help of our NOAA grant that we also have also received, and this grant started back in 2017, is to partner with the New York State Office of Climate Change. So the New York State Office of Climate Change was initially, and it's funny to look back now, kind of skeptical. They're like, sure, we'll be advisors on your NOAA grant. We're not really sure what kids can do, but yeah, that sounds like a good idea. You guys are nice people. I mean, that was essentially what they said. Next slide, please. But what has evolved from that is actually an incredible partnership. And that partnership really began when we started inviting staff from the Climate Smart Communities program, which is a part of the Office of Climate Change, to come to our youth climate summits and present about what they were doing. Next slide. And what the Climate Smart Communities program does is it's a voluntary program that's open to communities and of any size outside of New York City. And it creates a pathway essentially to reduce greenhouse gas, to build resiliency in the face of climate change. And once a community is both signed on to it and starts to kind of work down the scaffolding of tasks and actions that they require, there's help, technical assistance, there's opportunity to apply for funding. It's very comprehensive and flexible. Next slide. And as you can see, it's all throughout the state of New York. So most of the communities across, I mean, every community across the state has access to this program and the resources provided, but most communities don't know anything about it. Okay, next slide. And just as a note, I know I think there is only one other person on this call from New York State, but there is a number of different programs that are parallel to what the program we have in New York. So wherever you are, particularly in the Chesapeake watershed, you can look up on Sustainable States website or within this network and see what other programs are out there. And I'm going to mention a couple things about, we work with Massachusetts Audubon Society now, and they have youth climate summits. I think they've integrated that into their strategic plan. There's 8 to 10 summits across the state now, and they are now also working with their state resiliency network. So it's in a similar concept. Okay, next. So what happened when I mentioned we started inviting speakers from the CSE program to our climate summits is that the students started to be like, hey, we can do this as part of our climate action plan. And not only did they start doing that, but they really started to think about how they can start a dialogue with their local officials and like really start talking to them in a way that brought what students care about to the table. And this was really important because, as I mentioned, I work primarily in really rural communities, and oftentimes it's climate change, like people don't really talk about climate change, but what they do care about deeply are kids. And particularly, like oftentimes in these smaller communities, these young people are related to, might be related or neighbors of or know of, or it's their friend's dad or something or mom that sit on these different boards. And so there is a real window or a real pathway and opportunity for them to connect with these young people and connect with these decision makers and influencers in their community in a rich and authentic way. Next slide. So one of the case studies I wanted to mention, and if those of you were able to watch the video we sent out earlier, and I think someone could drop it into the chat, that would be awesome, is that we had students after the presentation that they heard at the Wild Center, like literally went outside and called their mayor and said, hey, why aren't we signed up for this? We'd love to do this. Can we do this? And that's basically what happened. And in this one community of Homer, the high school students actually took the lead and lead their climate resiliency task force. They led the greenhouse gas inventory. They led the sort of like going through the checklist of items that are part of the CSC bronze level certification, and really move the community forward in a really different way. And I really encourage you can see this all in the video that we just actually released a few weeks ago, the story of Homer and the community of Saranac Lake. Next slide. So here's some of our Homer students speaking with the mayor of Homer, the gentleman on the right, Hal, as well as the Climate Smart Communities lead, Dazzle. And this was, it was about building relationships. It was about the students being able to bring their concerns about climate resiliency to the table. And it had politics never entered the equation. In any of the communities where we've had young people bring climate change resiliency or resiliency as an issue to the table, we've never had any pushback, never had any never had never had any cause for concern. I mean, certainly the students have their own suite of assets that they can bring to their community, and our hope is that community leaders and decision makers can begin to see young people as assets to their community. They're extremely tech savvy, which is a huge help. Oftentimes in these rural communities, the town planners and the board members are very, oh, here comes Krista with my warning, I think.
Yeah, 2 minutes.
2 minutes. They see the opportunity to be able to, or the people that are working in these communities tend to be of an older generation and maybe not as tech savvy, but these students can come in and run social media campaigns. They can set up websites for them. They can do the greenhouse gas inventory, and they're also learning valuable job skills. Next slide. So we're really seeing some real success as young people have these conversations with their communities. Go ahead, next slide. And they're also having the opportunity and now have developed a relationship with the Climate Smart Communities program in New York State, and are going out and presenting at conferences, co-presenting with New York State's Climate Smart Communities program to other communities, and looking and being leaders and demonstrating that that other young people can be assets in those communities. Next slide. And most recently, we had 2 of our communities, Saranac Lake and Homer, become bronze certified climate smart communities. And these charges were both primarily led by high school students. Next slide. So some of the big takeaways in this is that the predefined goals of the Climate Smart Community certification were really helpful in facilitating the work between, pretty unlikely partners. It's unusual for a science museum to step in and be a big a catalyst for this kind of community resilience work. But I firmly come from a place where I believe that museums and other informal education institutions need to put themselves out there to do this. Next slide. It was important to find really concrete roles for students that align with their skills and passions. So that's one way to make that successful for the youth that might participate. Next slide. And helping adults learn how to make space for youth voice and ideas during meetings, and having someone that can serve as a mentor. Sometimes it's teachers, sometimes it's an institution like ours that can help support, but oftentimes there are mentors and communities that can really help support student involvement in any kind of resilience program. Next slide. And then give your own self permission to ease up on the content to make space for the participants to share and process what they're experiencing. I mean, we've really seen that across our programming right now in the midst of a pandemic and the election and systemic racism. We've really seen the relationships that youth have formed in their communities being and contributing to and helping to move forward that concept of resilience. Resilience, you know, can be thought about in so many ways, and having that opportunity to think about how we build up our own personal resilience to address kind of the social challenges and opportunities that we are facing is really important. And we need to think about how young people can be a partner in that and allies and accomplices. Okay, I think I have one or two more slides. Next slide. So here are some of our resources. I encourage you to check out that video. We have a free online toolkit around planning, how to plan a youth climate summit. We have a monthly network call. We have lots of ideas. Another toolkit we created for virtual summits. We just had a virtual summit in Pittsburgh with over 280 participants. So it's happening all over the place. And we are still engaging and working with young people right now. And they even more now, they are looking for ways to feel like they can contribute to a just and sustainable future. I guess last slide. So thanks so much. Please stay in touch and reach out to me. And thanks for your time.
Hey, Jen, thank you very much. And I think one of the, and it's in the chat here too, like people recognizing this too, is that the way in which you've engaged youth and giving them really kind of roles within addressing resilience in their communities and providing them avenues to taking on those roles, I think is really, for the audience here, I think is an important model, just like the citizen science piece or the community science piece, to say that there are these models, there are these strategies for engaging folks in capacity limited places, and both the community science and the work that your students ended up doing in New York to kind of get to that, to support resilience in those communities was part of helping to manage and address capacity issues. And I think that's huge. So I wanted to pass it off to Krista to kind of just tie things up a little bit here in terms of what's going on in this region to support environmental literacy and education programming and how that connects to resilience. So go ahead. Thank you, Krista, for taking that.
Yeah, so I was just going to share a few resources that you can use to maybe help work in creating some of these partnerships. So the first one is the Climate Resilience Toolkit. So when you go to this website, it has a great step-by-step guide on how to guide you through your work, right? So the first step is all about creating that team, thinking about the partners that you should be involving, exploring hazards, and then it walks you through looking through solutions, and then finally to action. And yeah, like we heard, youth can be a really powerful member of that team. They can bring new ideas and new energy. And make sure you go to this toolkit because there's also great case studies. So you can read about other things that are happening across the country in a variety of communities. So next slide, please. So if you are interested in engaging youth, especially at a school, you probably know that you should come with a program that's ready to meet standards, meet curriculum, so it can be brought right into instruction. And a meaningful watershed educational experience is a great way to do that. So you'll hear us often talk about MIWIs, so it's MIWI for short, and it's part of the environmental literacy goal of the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. And the agreement recommends that every student in the Chesapeake Bay Watershed get a MIWI once in elementary, middle, and high school. So there's many different times that you can engage different ages of kids. And it's all project-based learning. These up here are the essential elements that all students go through during their MIWI program. And it starts with them looking at locally relevant environmental issues and then walking them through doing an evidence-based, student-directed action project. So you can imagine that a community resilience project could work in really nice with this framework. Next slide. And just to show you how it could complement each other, on this slide, I have, again, the 4 essential elements of a MIWI and those steps to resilience that are in the toolkit. So if you could click once, Meredith. So when students are looking at the issue, the locally relevant environmental issue, that could also relate to exploring hazards in their community and assessing all the risk. So another click. All MIWI should have at least one outdoor field experience. Ideally, there's more. And that experience could happen maybe at the beginning stages when they're seeing the hazards in person, or maybe at the end when they're taking action. And the next click. And throughout the MIWI, they should always be looking at their observations and data, synthesizing it, and forming conclusions. And of course, that could happen through multiple stages of the steps to resilience too, when they're thinking about solutions and making plans and decisions. And then one more. So the final component is all about action. And action can look very different. A MIWI could have a single action project or multiple ones. Maybe it's a boots on the ground type of thing, where students are involved in making a coastline more resilient, doing some type of planting. Or it could also be about civic engagement, engaging with the local officials, or also just informing the public, telling the public about the hazards they discovered, and even recommendations about what could happen in the future. So there's many opportunities that MIWIs and resilience work can work together. Next slide. And so at NOAA Environmental Science Training Center, we just want to tell you that we started working and making these connections between the education community and resilience work. We had 3 different workshops this past winter. And as you can see, we brought together a variety of people. And we started thinking about how you can incorporate talk of resilience into your current education programs, your climate change education programs, and thinking about how you can engage new partnerships to make those programs stronger. So Bart and I are happy to talk to any of you about what we did do in those workshops and what we learned from them. So last slide. And then we just have a quick plug. Our office manages the NOAA BWET grant. And so if you're interested in working with the school using that MIWI framework, this grant can help fund that work. You can go to next slide.
Thank you very much, Krista. And so I think one of the things that we hope to kind of communicate during this session was just that like engaging the community around resilience is absolutely essential, and education partners are and community institutions are ready and willing partners in a lot of ways to help support this work, and but also kind of vice versa too, because the way I look at it, like from the education programming that I'm involved in and some of the partners that we work with, connecting to stakeholders, connecting to people that are leading resilience work like yourselves, are also really essential partners for us in terms of both having a sense of the landscape around resilience out there, but also supporting the education programming generally. And so we would love to carry this conversation forward and take that on. And we're gonna and hopefully do that. Before we get to kind of the last piece in the discussion, folks, we did have one more mentee that we were hoping you all could chime in on. And so Krista, I think, well, Krista just shared a link there. I'll put the mentee link back into the chat. But you can either click there again or go to mentee.com and use the code on your phone to get to that mentee for our last question. Jeremy, was there any other instructions I needed to provide on that one?
No, just go back to that same link. You might still have the browser open, and you should be able to provide your answers about, like, based on all that you've heard today, which is a lot. We'd love to know, like, what kind of ideas you might have for new partners, new programs, whatever that may be. Kind of get a little short brainstorm into the mentee. It should start populating. Ooh.
It's funny. It's so hard to to type and think and all that sort of stuff at the same time. This is cool.
I think we're seeing kind of the same, some of the, big youth focus coming out. That's great. These summits. It's basically everything that we said today is now being reflected in their ideas. It's almost like it's like a learning experience, Bart.
I like it. Way to design that, Jeremy. Yeah, it's interesting too, like social media bubbling up is one of the other key features or key things to think about how we engage folks. And one of the things that resonates with me from this morning's plenary was really all about using art, creativity, video, interactive stuff, rich media to engage people in issues around climate change, around resilience. And I think that's one of those places that personally I am very weak, but recognize the benefit of in a huge way. So I think that's kind of neat. Cool. Still stuff coming in. It was great.
Yeah, and we did have that one, like, rate your opinion, if you want to include that one right here at the end, Bart, or if you wanted to do some more just open discussion, up to you.
Yeah, so I was thinking maybe if we close this one out and then that one will come up, but maybe you can just stop sharing your screen for a second and we can do that open discussion, because there was a couple questions that were still floating out in the chat that we might not have gotten to. But I also wanted to kind of just put things out on the floor to see if anybody had any other key nuggets that they wanted to highlight, throughout this conversation. And I think, Tally had a number of good points in here, and like one of the earlier questions I think she posted was about connecting to rural areas, and Jen, you kind of addressed that and kind of the capacity issues there, and the need there. But I also know, Jeremy, you're working in a more rural context as well, or you have partners out in Western Virginia that you're working with to kind of explore some of this. So I don't know if you wanted to add anything to those notions.
Well, I think the interesting thing is that many of the same ways that you can engage with assessing resilience are the same. Like the same kind of discussions around how to make a city more resilient to climate change. The climate resilience toolkit is meant to be used throughout contexts, from urban to extra urban to rural. And so many of those same exercises, like finding community organizations that might already be doing something like what you are looking to do, that can work regardless of context. Citizen science or community science programs can be also distributed in rural contexts. We worked with Augusta County Schools in Virginia, up in the Shenandoah Valley, a little bit about even urban heat islands, which is kind of funny because you wouldn't think of that being an issue, but their school, based on land surface temperature data, was an urban heat island. So they did some engagement around how to change the color of the parking lot and to plant some trees. And it was the same kinds of information, same kinds of processes and physics work everywhere, regardless of the exact context.
Thank you, Jeremy. Frank, I think I saw you put your hand up there and unmute.
Yeah, sure. Tally had a point in one of her comments about the connection to jobs and workforce. And I think that is a really critical piece that is still emerging. There's a lot more that we have to unpack, and a relationship between education, community, jobs, workforce, and capacity. Because let's just remember, foundationally, the amount of work involved in going to resilience or dealing with the underlying cause, the low carbon economy, it's a huge work part, and there are new skills, there's new capabilities, and it is a critical element that is, we just don't have a firm handle on it, especially related to resilience. Like, what are resilience jobs? That gets really fuzzy. That said, I think it is a critical element of when you look at Jeremy, your point about hyperlocal and the intersection of justice and equity, I think that this is an essential area for all of us to continue to work towards improving our understanding and actually how to use that. I mean, Jen, some of your work in your grants have actually found you expanding capacity of rural communities in doing some of this work, whether it's, vulnerability assessments, greenhouse gas inventories. There's real work here that somebody's got to do if you're going to actually properly target your resilience efforts. And sometimes the money is not there, so bring community into it, and youth can do it immensely. And that's surprising. That surprised me when it happened. I don't know, Jen, if it surprised you, but that capacity dimension is not, it's not trivial. But I imagine those people who are doing that are eventually going to actually they're going to get jobs in that. So they're learning by doing, but eventually they'll be actually hopefully getting properly employed.
Yeah, they definitely, we've definitely seen like an increase in young people that go through our program that are entering into the workforce or looking at pursuing college in sort of climate related areas, whether it's policy or engineering or science. Like we definitely see a lot of young people that we work with that are doing it. And I know there were some other questions in the chat and we're just about out of time, but I will, please feel free to email me again, if you have additional questions, and I can get back to you or send you resources.
And we'll publish these slides, which have all of our contact info in the last slide too, so that make sure that you have all that contact information. And I think this notion of resilience, education, all that, and future workforce, like this is one of those other elements of intersectionality that exists, right? There's so much work we can do around resilience that helps support so many other really important things going on in our society today, to prepare us for a future that we want, right? And so please, we'd love to stay engaged with this. We really appreciate you all joining us for this session. And we're happy to stay on for a few minutes afterwards as well. But with that, I'm going to tear back to Meredith for closing little bits.
Yeah, well, how about everyone, we give our amazing panelists a virtual round of applause. You can always add a reaction, the clappy sign to your Zoom box. Thank you all so much for a wonderful presentation. We would love to hear your feedback on the session, so please go to Sketch and provide your comments and reactions to what you learned. And a gentle reminder that if you want to share pictures of yourself in your outdoor settings, to use the hashtags Chess Forum and Chess Collective. A photo tagged with that could enter you into a raffle to win an autographed book of Elizabeth Rush's Rising. So this is the end of our session presentations for today. If you had signed up for coaching hours with River Network or consulting hours with NIFWIS, you can go to that now. And if not, you can, we'll see everyone 9 a.m. for our amazing keynote with Elizabeth Rush. But thank you again so much to our incredible panelists. Thank you so much, Meredith Dash, for handling the technical aspects of our panel. And many thanks to Jenny McGarvey for all of the hard work she's done in organizing the forum. Thank you all so much.